They were closing the casket when she leaned in close behind my shoulder and whispered, "You have a week to get out." I still had the funeral program in my lap. My fingers gripped it without meaning to, crushing the edge. I didn't turn around. I just sat there, frozen, pretending I hadn't heard her while the priest kept talking about closure and peace. My son, Aaron, was gone. 33 years old, heart attack out of nowhere, and the only person I had in this world who ever gave a damn about me. And now I'm sitting next to his casket while his wife, Madison, wears a tailored black dress and crocodile tears, already planning my eviction. She squeezed my shoulder after saying it, real gentle, like she was comforting me. I didn't move. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and please tell me and others, what's one life lesson everyone should hear before it's too late? Share it in the comments below. Thanks. She stood up and walked over to greet a new guest. "She's been so strong," someone said behind me. "Losing a husband at her age, I can't even imagine." I wanted to laugh, but my chest just burned. I stayed quiet through the service, through the final prayer, even when people started heading toward the reception hall. When it was time to leave, Madison made a point to help her grandmother to the car, but left me standing by myself. I rode with her in Aaron's car, but she didn't say a word. The car smelled like his cologne, and I thought maybe that would break me, but I was too busy trying to figure out what game she was playing. At the house, she led everyone in. She gave a little speech about Aaron's strength and humor and how much he loved family. I stood behind the kitchen island and said nothing. She passed out wine, made a toast, hugged people like a widow on TV. But I noticed small things. The family photo by the stairs, gone. His army medal case, removed. She was scrubbing him out already. After everyone left, I went to my room, the one I'd lived in for 7 years, and the door was open. My blankets were folded. The nightstand lamp was unplugged. I checked the dresser. Half my drawers were empty, jewelry box gone. The closet had boxes labeled "Mom's stuff." I stood there for a minute, like my brain needed time to catch up. I walked out, past the kitchen. Madison was sitting at the dining table with a glass of wine, phone in hand. She didn't look up. I cleared my throat. "Did you move my things?" She finally glanced at me and said, "I was just organizing. There's a moving company I can call when you're ready." Then she smiled, like it was a polite offer. I asked where my jewelry was. She said, "Some of it's in the safe. You wouldn't want to lose anything while people were in and out." I said I never asked her to touch my things. She sipped her wine. "Aaron and I talked about this," she said. "It's not personal. We just assumed you'd want to move back to your sister's." "I don't have a sister. She knows that." I stared at her. "This is my home." She shrugged. It was his home. He would have wanted us to have space to grieve. Then she picked up her phone like I wasn't even there. I walked out before I said something stupid. I went back to my room and checked the drawers again, trying to stay calm, trying to think. The box I kept under the bed was gone. I opened the closet and saw a bin marked "Old Docs." I pulled it down and dug through it. Receipts, old mail, warranty papers. Then I found it, my file folder with old medical records, bank papers, and my passport. I kept digging, heart racing. I didn't find the deed, the one with my name on it, the one Aaron insisted we keep together, back when they bought this house and I helped with the down payment after he lost his job. That paper was supposed to be in this box. I checked twice. Madison's voice floated down the hall. "Hey, do you want leftover salad or should I toss it?" I didn't answer. My hand was shaking now. The deed was gone. The next morning, the kitchen was silent, and the smell of coffee was already gone by the time I stepped in. Madison was at the dining table, typing on her laptop like it was any other Tuesday. She looked up and said, "Morning. Just checking a few quotes for movers." I opened the fridge. My name-labeled containers were gone, replaced by neatly stacked Tupperware that wasn't mine. "I didn't ask for movers," I said. She smiled without looking. "Right, but you said you wanted to handle things on your timeline." I figured it might help. She took a sip from her mug and clicked something fast. I went to the living room. My son's old recliner had been replaced with a fake-looking leather chair. His blanket was folded and stuffed behind the TV stand, like a dog bed. "Where's Aaron's recliner?" I asked. She shrugged. It was old, didn't fit the room anymore. I stared at her. It's been a week. She looked annoyed now. It's been 9 days. I'm not going to sit in. A dead man's chair, Ellen. That was the first time she said his name, like it meant nothing. I turned and walked outside just to breathe. I sat on the porch steps, pulled out my phone, and called a lawyer Aaron once recommended back when we were updating our wills. The secretary said he could see me that afternoon. I didn't tell Madison where I was going. I just left. The lawyer, Mr. Holt, remembered Aaron immediately. Solid guy, he said. I'm sorry. I told him what was happening, how Madison claimed I had to leave, how my name had been on the deed, how the document was missing. He asked how long I'd lived there. 7 years, I said, since they bought it. He asked if I had any written record of paying into the down payment. I said I used a cashier's check. I still had the receipt. His eyes lit up. Then we may have something. I asked him to explain. He said if my name was on the deed and I had proof of contribution, she couldn't force me out. Not legally. He told me to find that cashier's check and, if possible, the original purchase paperwork. I thanked him and drove home with my hands gripping the wheel too tight. Madison was on the phone when I got back, pacing near the hallway. No, she doesn't know anything, she said into the phone, lowering her voice when she saw me. It's handled. I walked past her and went straight to the attic. Aaron had kept boxes up there from before they were married. Old school. Files, taxes, moving docs. I climbed up, heart pounding, and started pulling boxes open. Dust everywhere. I found his university box, his military records box, then one labeled Home Purchase. My breath caught. I yanked it out, sat on the attic floor, and started, flipping through it. Closing statements, home insurance, bank loan approvals, and then there it was, a manila envelope marked Final Deed. I opened it and stared. My name, my signature, his, dated, notarized, filed. I sat there for a second, letting it sink in. Madison was bluffing. She either didn't know, or she knew and hoped I didn't. I tucked the folder into my coat and climbed down. She was standing at the bottom of the attic ladder. Looking for something? She asked, eyebrows raised. I looked her in the eye. Just some old paperwork, nothing important. She smiled tightly. That's good. I wouldn't want you to get stressed. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen like we hadn't, just had a silent showdown. That night I made copies of the deed and scanned it into my email. I created a folder labeled For Lawyer Only. I wasn't stupid. She thought she was ahead. But now I had leverage. I just needed to move carefully. Around 9 p.m. she came in with 2 glasses of wine and said, I figured we should talk. Clear. The air. I took the glass, but didn't drink. Okay. She sat on the couch across from me. I know things have been tense, but Aaron always said this house was for us, for our future family. I said nothing. She looked down at her glass. I don't want it to get ugly. I just want to move forward. I stared at her hand, left ring finger still wearing his wedding band. She looked up. You understand, right? I asked. Have you spoken to a lawyer? Her face twitched. No, I didn't think it was necessary. I smiled. Maybe it is. Her eyes narrowed for a second. She took a sip of wine. Are you threatening me, Ellen? I smiled back. No, just thinking out loud. She stood up slowly. I hope we can do this the easy way. I nodded. So do I. She walked down the hall, glass still in hand. I waited until she was out of sight, then pulled out my phone and checked the scanned deed one more time. My name, clear as day. She thought she had me boxed in, but she didn't know what I'd just found upstairs. The next morning, I printed 2 copies of the deed and tucked them into a sealed envelope marked with my lawyer's name. I dropped it off at his office without calling ahead, told his assistant it was time-sensitive, then walked out before she could ask questions. Back at the house, Madison was in the garage clearing shelves like she'd already moved on from grief. She looked up as I pulled in. Hey, she said casually, just getting rid of junk. Hope that's okay. I nodded and walked inside, pretending not to notice that Aaron's fishing gear was gone. I went to my room, opened the top drawer of my nightstand, and found it locked. That drawer had never had a lock. I got a flathead screwdriver and pried it open. Inside, my prescription bottle was gone. So was my small cash envelope. She was sending a message. She wanted me to know I had no privacy left. I sat on the bed and breathed through my teeth until the burn in my chest passed. Then I did something I hadn't done since Aaron died. I opened his filing cabinet in the office. Third drawer down. I found a folder labeled Refinance Options. Inside were newer mortgage statements with both our names, dated less than a year ago. That mattered. Madison hadn't been added, not even after the refinance. I snapped a photo and backed it up to my cloud. I heard Madison's voice in the hallway, talking to someone on speakerphone. "Yeah, she's still here, I know. It's awkward, but she doesn't have any real claim." A pause. Then, "No, her name's not on the current utilities or tax bills. It'll be fine." I stepped into the hallway and made just enough noise for her to know I heard. She turned fast, eyes wide. "Everything okay?" she asked. I said, "You really should be careful what you say in this house. The walls are thin." Then I went back to the kitchen and started making coffee like nothing had happened. The rest of the day, she stayed out of my way. Around 6 p.m. I walked past the living room and saw she'd replaced the family portrait with a landscape print, blue mountains and empty snow. No people. I stared at it longer than I meant to. That night she ordered Chinese food and left mine. In the bag on the counter, no note, no courtesy. I took the food, closed my door, and locked it from the inside with the door wedge I'd kept since last week. I wasn't taking chances. At 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside my room. Slow, deliberate. I got up, pressed my ear to the door. No knock, just a pause, then retreating steps. In the morning, the alarm clock was flashing. Power had gone out for exactly 1 minute. I checked the circuit breaker. All switches were fine. I didn't say a word to her at breakfast. She offered me coffee like nothing had happened. I declined. Then I went back to the lawyer. This time I sat down across from Mr. Holt and handed him the photos, refinance documents, and deed copies. He reviewed them one by one, nodding. "She has no legal standing," he said. "Her name never appears, and you've contributed both, financially and residentially, for over 7 years. If she tries to evict you, she'll lose." I asked if I could file preemptively. He nodded. "We'll draft a notice of shared ownership and prepare a legal response to any false claim. If she serves you anything, we respond immediately." I asked about my risk. He said, "Only if you lose your documents. Keep them safe and stay calm." I drove home with a new kind of silence in my chest. Not grief, not fear, but focus. When I walked in, Madison was folding laundry on the couch. She looked up and said, "Did you go somewhere?" I said, "Just needed fresh air." She raised an eyebrow. "You seem confident all of a sudden." I smiled and said, "I just remembered something important." She stared for a second, then said, "Well, I hope it doesn't make things harder." I opened the fridge and saw my labeled food was back. Same handwriting. That night I heard her in the guest room, talking. On the phone again. "Yeah, she's acting weird. I might need to move up the timeline." Another pause. "If she finds that file, we're screwed." She didn't know I already had it. She didn't know the file was already with a lawyer. But now I knew for certain she was hiding something bigger than just a property dispute, and I was about to find out what. 3 days later, Madison hosted what she called a grief gathering for Aaron's friends and co-workers, something she announced casually over coffee as if it were a birthday brunch. "Just a little closure," she said, pouring almond milk into her mug while ignoring the second one I had placed beside it. She didn't ask me to help prep for it, which was fine. She barely acknowledged me at all that week, except to ask me to keep the guest bathroom clean and to not mention any personal matters if I spoke with anyone. I didn't argue, said nothing, but I watched. I watched as she brought out Aaron's old bar cart and stocked it like she was throwing a cocktail party. Watched her line the counter with mini quiches and imported crackers like we hadn't just buried him. The first guest arrived just after 6, Aaron's friend Kyle from work. He gave me a long hug and whispered, "He talked about you all the time, said you were the one person he could always count on." I nodded, holding back tears. Then came others, neighbors, co-workers, a few of Madison's Pilates friends. Some I recognized, Others I didn't. Madison floated through the room like a gracious host, glass in hand, giving little speeches about Aaron's generosity and light. I stood near the back wall, watching her smile at strangers while ignoring the fact she'd gutted his room and thrown out his books. At one point, someone asked me how I was holding up. I said, "As well as I can be, considering I still live here." The woman looked confused. I added, "Aaron and I co-owned the house. Madison's handling things now, but I still live here." Her eyebrows lifted. "Oh, I thought she said it was hers." I smiled politely. Easy mistake. An hour later, I caught Madison watching me from across the room. Her face was still smiling, but her eyes had changed, tight and assessing. She came over when things quieted and said, "Can I speak to you for a moment?" I followed her into the hallway. She shut the door behind us. "Are you trying to start something?" I said. I answered a question honestly. She stepped closer. "Don't play cute, Ellen. These people don't need to hear about paperwork." I folded my arms. "Then stop lying about it." She stared at me hard, then composed herself. "Look, this is delicate. These are people who cared about Aaron. They're here to support me." I said, "Then maybe don't throw a wine mixer in the house you're trying to erase him from." Her face flushed. "If you don't want to be here, you're free to leave." I smiled. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere." She leaned in close, whispering just like she did at the funeral. "You think you're clever, Ellen, but you don't know how this works. I'll make sure you regret staying." Then she walked out with that same polite expression and greeted the next guest like we hadn't just hissed threats at each other in the hallway. The rest of the evening I stayed quiet. I watched. I listened. I noticed one guest, a man in his 40s with a shaved head and designer coat, kept looking at me like he was trying to place me. He spoke briefly with Madison near the hallway, then left early. Something about the way he moved, cautious and low-voiced, stuck with me. After everyone left, Madison cleaned up silently. I offered no help. She didn't ask. At midnight, I walked past the guest room and saw the manila folder in her open tote bag. It wasn't there earlier. I stepped back into my room, grabbed my phone, and took a silent photo through the crack in her door. The folder said, "Doc copies, backup plan." That night I waited until I heard her shower. Then I stepped into the hallway and opened the tote. Inside were multiple folders, one marked House Timeline, another labeled E-Signatures 2023. I didn't take anything, I just photographed. One file had a screenshot of a will with a digital signature I didn't recognize. The bottom corner said, "Filed March 4th. Aaron died February 2nd. He hadn't signed anything in March." I stood there, breath frozen, as the water shut off. I moved fast, closed her bag, stepped back into my room, and waited in silence as she passed the hallway humming, wrapped in a robe. My hands were still shaking, but now I had more than just a deed. I had proof she was trying to forge control. Something bigger was happening here, and tomorrow I was going to dig even deeper into whatever E-Signatures 2023 was supposed to cover. I woke up the next morning to the sound of sniffling in the kitchen. Not loud sobs, just a delicate pattern of quiet crying meant to be overheard. And when I walked in, Madison was standing by the sink in her robe, holding a crumpled tissue and staring out the window like she was in a soap opera. But as soon as she noticed me, she turned around and wiped under her eyes with the edge of her palm, forcing a smile like she was being brave for someone, and said, "I'm sorry, sometimes it hits me all over again." And then she placed a hand on her belly, not dramatically, but just enough that I noticed, and I froze because that was new, and she looked up and said softly, "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. I'm pregnant, Ellen." And for a full 5 seconds I couldn't speak, couldn't move, because it didn't make any sense, not after everything I'd seen, and not with the timing, and I asked, "How far along?" And she replied quickly, 8 weeks, maybe 9. And that snapped everything into place because Aaron had been dead for 10, and I just stared at her, trying not to show the alarm ripping through my chest, while she walked over and placed the sonogram photo on the table like a trump card. And I picked it up, turning it slowly, noticing the corner, her name, the clinic, and the date printed in clean black type. Not 10 weeks ago, but 4. And that was the moment I realized the pregnancy had nothing to do with Aaron at all, and Everything to do with control. And she said, I used a donor. Aaron and I had talked about it, just in case. He wanted me to have a piece of him. And I knew in that second that it was a lie, that Aaron would have told me something that major. And I looked at her and said nothing, just handed the photo back without reacting. And she added, I hope you understand now why it's so important for me to have stability, for the baby's sake. And I realized then she was setting up a sympathy narrative, something she could use in court if it came to that. The grieving widow expecting a child and being forced to share a home with an unstable mother-in-law. And I nodded slowly and told her, that changes things. And her whole face softened like she believed I was folding, like her little performance had worked. But the second she left the room, I grabbed my phone, pulled up the photo I'd taken of the document in her bag, and matched the sonogram date with the file date. 4 days apart, both from the same week, both planted like evidence, and I forwarded them to Mr. Holt with a short message. We need to talk. And within an hour he called me back and said, this actually helps us. If she's claiming dependency or emotional hardship, we can force her to show medical records and timeline consistency. And I asked, what if she faked the entire thing? And he said, then it's fraud, and if you keep documenting this calmly, we'll win before it ever reaches trial. And I said, she's trying to bait me into reacting. And he replied, then don't. And I didn't. I kept quiet. I cleaned the bathroom. I folded laundry. I smiled when she made little comments like, this baby's going to need so much space, or it's going to be hard raising. A child in a hostile environment. And each time she looked at me like she was gauging how close I was to snapping, and I just nodded and kept my mouth shut. Until that Friday, when I got an envelope slid under my door in a manila folder marked urgent 48 hours notice. And inside was a typed document, clearly not court-filed, stating that I had 48 hours to vacate the property due to emotional instability and personal threats. And I sat there staring at it, heart pounding not from fear, but from how sloppily she just handed me a lie I could crush with one email. And as I reread it, I noticed one final line at the bottom that made my skin crawl. Failure to vacate will result in law enforcement involvement and potential elder neglect claims. And that was it. That was the card she'd decided to play. She was going to paint me as a dangerous old woman in court, unstable and violent, even though I'd done nothing but make toast and fold towels. And now she was forcing a move, triggering a panic, hoping I'd run before I fought back, and I knew what I had to do next. I had to stop waiting for her to overplay her hand, because she just did. I didn't say a word after reading that fake eviction notice. I just folded it slowly, slid it into a new folder with the other documents Madison had conveniently gifted me over the last 2 weeks, and drove straight to Mr. Holt's office. No appointment, no delay, because this was no longer about defending my right to live in the house. This was about dismantling the fantasy world she was trying to build. And when I sat down across from him and handed over the newest file, his eyes scanned the last line, and he actually chuckled, not out of amusement but disbelief, and said, she's threatening you with elder neglect charges while you're the one being emotionally harassed, documented, and financially gaslighted. And I told him everything about the fake pregnancy timeline, the IVF clinic label, the donor date, the staged photos, the phone calls I overheard at night, and the conversations I baited her into without ever raising my voice. And he said, we're beyond civil conflict now. This is pre-fraud litigation territory, and if she's altered financial documents or used your identity in any capacity, we could be looking at criminal charges. And I asked, what's the fastest way to prove it? And he said, we request a discovery subpoena on her digital records, emails, text logs, medical submissions, banking. And I said, will a judge even grant that? And he replied, if we show the forged eviction, pregnancy inconsistency, and misrepresentation of the deed ownership, all documented, we don't just have a case, we have leverage. And I sat there breathing in the fact that for the first time since Aaron died, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was about to flip the script on the person who thought she could erase me. And on my way home, I stopped at a print shop and ordered 3 bound copies of everything. The deed with my name, the refinance record, the ultrasound photo with the false date, the text of the eviction threat, the names of every person who saw her try to rewrite the house's history during the grief gathering, and I labeled the binder spine case file Madison, then put one copy in my safe deposit box, one at my lawyer's office, and one under the floorboard of my closet, where she wouldn't find it even if she tore the place apart. And when I came home that night, she was in the kitchen on a video call, headset in, laughing about some new real estate opportunity, and said to the person on the screen, "Yeah, I'll have access to the place within 2 weeks, tops." And I stood behind the wall, frozen in place, realizing that she wasn't just trying to win the house out of grief or insecurity, she was flipping it, maybe even planning to sell it, which meant she wasn't even staying here. Long term, she just wanted the property rights for her own gain. And I stepped into the room and made sure she saw me, didn't say anything, just walked to the fridge, pulled out a water bottle, and stared at her until she ended the call. And she turned, slowly, and said, "Do you need something?" And I said, "Just a heads up. If another envelope comes to my door, make sure it's court-stamped. Anything less goes straight to my attorney." And she blinked fast like I'd slapped her, then said, "Are you threatening me now?" And I replied, "You started the paperwork war, Madison. I'm just keeping mine legal." And I walked out before she could reply. And that night, I did one last thing. I opened Aaron's old email account, which he'd once shared access to when I helped him job hunt years ago. And the password, his favorite song lyric plus his service number, still worked. And what I found wasn't much, mostly job applications and bills. But then I found a flagged folder marked Estate, and inside were PDFs, including one labeled Draft Will Feb 2023, and when I opened it, I stopped breathing, because the signature at the bottom didn't match his handwriting. The notary seal was cropped and reused, and worst of all, the document listed Madison as sole heir and property owner with no mention of me, even though the date was 1 week before his death, and I printed it without touching a thing, heart pounding, realizing this was it, the thing she was trying to hide. The file she must have buried in the folder I'd seen in her tote, and this version had metadata from her computer name, not Aaron's, not a legal firm, just Madison K. Drafts. And I sent the file straight to Mr. Holt and wrote, "She forged his will," and I didn't even flinch as I pressed send. The next morning, Holt called me before I even finished my toast, his voice calm but firm as he said, "We're filing today." And that was the moment everything shifted from quiet defense to active offense, because now we had digital proof. Of forgery, proof of intent to defraud, proof of manipulated legal documents with a traceable computer signature. And he walked me through our next moves step by step, filing a motion to freeze any transfer of the property title, requesting a court review of the will, submitting a fraud alert through the probate court, and placing a protective notice on the house to stop any unauthorized sale or refinance attempt. And he added, "You don't have to serve her. The court will." And I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, because finally someone else was going to speak for me, and I wouldn't have to keep pretending I was powerless in the house I helped pay for. And by noon that day, Madison must have felt something shift, because she got weirdly friendly, offering to make lunch, asking if I wanted to help her shop for baby things. And when I said no, she tilted her head and asked, "Are we good?" And I just smiled and said, "We'll see." And that afternoon, while she was out, I got a call from a process server who said, "We'll be delivering a set of papers later today. Do not engage." And I said, "Trust me, I won't." And I sat on the couch with the blinds open and waited. And around 5 p.m., she pulled into the driveway in her new SUV, 2 shopping bags in hand. And the second she stepped onto the porch, a man in a gray jacket appeared from his car, walked up the steps, and said her full name with a clean, practiced tone. And she paused, confused, said, "Yes." And he handed her a thick envelope and said, "You've been served. Probate fraud and property injunction." And she blinked, lips parting, and asked, "What the hell is this?" And he said, "You'll need to read it," then walked away, without another word. And I watched her from the living room window, holding the envelope like it had weight, staring at the seal. And then her eyes flicked toward the house, toward me, And I didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there until she came inside with quick steps and slammed the envelope on the dining table, opened it, scanned the first page, then the second, and I heard her whisper, "No, no, no," and then louder, "She's lying. This is all lies." And she turned to me and shouted, "What did you tell them?" And I stood up and said, "I didn't tell them anything. The documents did." And she threw the envelope onto the floor and stormed into the kitchen, muttering, "I'll fix this. This isn't happening." And I didn't say a word, because she wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to the world that had finally said no to her. And that night, she didn't eat, didn't talk, didn't even come out of her room. And the next morning, I found her pacing the front yard on the phone with someone, hissing, "Just get me a lawyer." Who knows how to bury this? And then, "I don't care what it costs. She's just an old woman." And I stood on the porch with my arms crossed, letting her know I heard every word, and 2 days later, the court date was set, a preliminary hearing to establish will validity and deed ownership. And when we showed up, Madison walked in wearing a cream blazer and holding her fake ultrasound photo like a prop, and her attorney started in with a soft-voiced performance about widowhood, grief, and maternal protection. But Holt shut it down with cold evidence, side-by-side comparisons of Erin's real signature and the one she'd submitted, metadata trails from her laptop proving she'd opened and edited the document herself, plus the refinancing records. That excluded her entirely, and then came the kicker, the deed, in my name and Erin's, legally recorded, unmodified, and untouched by Madison in any legal form. And when Holt said, "Your Honor, my client has been a co-owner of this property since day one," the judge leaned forward, reviewed the file, and said, "Counselor, this is extremely clear." And I watched Madison's entire posture collapse, shoulders sinking, mouth twitching like she wanted to scream but couldn't. And then the judge said, "Temporary ownership freeze is lifted. Ms. Ellen retains legal co-ownership. All eviction claims are void. As for the will, subject to fraud investigation." And Madison's lawyer whispered something fast, and she looked at him like he'd betrayed her, and I stood there, steady, silent, strong, because this wasn't a victory lap. This was just the truth finally spoken out loud. And as we left the courtroom, Holt turned to me and said, "Now we wait to see if she pushes back or packs her bags." And when we got in the car, I checked my phone, saw an email from the court system confirming full ownership recognition status, and I smiled, not out of spite, but out of relief, because she could twist stories and fake photos all she wanted, but now the law knew what she really was. The house was too quiet the next morning, not peaceful, but charged, like the kind of silence before a storm, and when I walked into the kitchen, Madison was already there, dressed in all black like she was going to another funeral, sitting at the table with her untouched coffee and a legal pad in front of her filled with names and phone numbers, and she didn't look up when I entered, just said, "You think you've won?" And I poured my own coffee without answering, letting her fill the silence with her own unraveling. And she went on, "You think just because you got a judge to believe your little story, that it's over?" And I finally turned and said, "It wasn't a story, Madison. It was the law." And that snapped something in her because she stood up so fast the chair screeched against the tile, and she said, "You don't get to steal everything from me." And I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You tried to erase me from a house I helped build, in a life I was always part of, and you used a fake will and a fake pregnancy to do it." And she froze, mouth open, and then tried to shift gears, saying, "I was grieving, but it didn't land." Not anymore, because the act was dead and we both knew it, and I said, "Pack your things. I'm giving you the same respect you never gave me. I'm not calling the sheriff. Yet." And she opened her mouth like she was going to yell, then shut it again, grabbed her phone, and stormed out of the house. And I sat down and sipped my coffee, finally tasting it without fear in my throat. And for the next few hours the house stayed quiet, not just on the surface, but inside too, like the first breath after months underwater. And I went into Erin's old room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the empty bookshelf, the walls he painted himself, and I said quietly, "We're okay now, baby. I promise. And then I opened his top drawer, the one I hadn't touched since the funeral, and found something I didn't expect. A folded sheet of paper, handwritten, unsigned, with his handwriting, dated 3 weeks before his death. And it started with, "If anything happens to me, I need you to know I'm sorry." And I felt my chest lock up as I kept reading, line after line of guilt, frustration, regret, about how he'd let Madison isolate him from people. How he knew she was manipulative, but he was trying to fix it. How he felt like he couldn't tell me things anymore because she made him feel like choosing sides. And at the bottom, it read, "Don't let her take everything. This house was always ours, not hers. Do what you have to do, Mom." And my hands started shaking, not from grief, but from clarity, because even in death he had tried to give me the final word, and I took the letter, scanned it into my phone, and locked it in my drawer next to the deed. And by sunset, Madison returned with a face full of fire and said, "You'll regret this." "I'll go to the press. I'll tell them you bullied a grieving widow." And I said, "Then I'll show them the ultrasound dates, the will metadata, and the letter Erin left me." And her face went pale like she'd seen a ghost, because she didn't know about that last one, and she whispered, "You're bluffing." And I said, "Try me." And she turned around and walked away, slamming her door so hard a frame fell off the hallway wall, and I didn't flinch. I just picked up the frame, reset it, and made dinner like it was any other night. And while the pasta boiled, I texted Holt and said, "Found a personal letter, strengthens motive. I'll forward." And he replied within seconds, "Send. It's bulletproof." And that night, for the first time in months, I slept with the window open, no door wedge, no backup key under the pillow, just silence and cool air. And in the morning, I heard boxes being packed. By Sunday morning, the hall outside Madison's bedroom was lined with cardboard boxes, some labeled, some not, some with tape barely holding the flaps closed like she'd packed them in a hurry. And I didn't ask if she was really leaving, because I already knew. She was out of legal cards to play, and whatever bluff she was clinging to had crumbled under the weight of court documents and her own arrogance. And when she came into the kitchen, she didn't speak at first, just opened a drawer like she was looking for something that had never been there to begin with. Then finally turned to me and said, "I'll be out by Friday." And I nodded, no smile, no sarcasm, just a calm nod like it was a logistics meeting and not the end of a months-long war. And she added, "You can have your house back." And I said, "It was never yours to give." And that hit her harder than yelling ever would have, because she froze for a second, then looked away like she wanted to spit something back, but couldn't find a word that wouldn't snap in her mouth. And I walked past her and put the kettle on the stove, not to be dramatic, but because I genuinely wanted tea. And I'd learned by now that the most powerful move I had left was not reacting, just continuing to live like she was already gone. And later that afternoon she had 2 friends over, loud voices in the hallway, helping her lift boxes, and I stayed in my room. While they whispered things like, "She's insane," and "How did you even live here with her?" And I didn't say a word because those weren't questions worth answering. And then the next morning she tried one last pathetic move. She called Erin's old friend Kyle, left him a voicemail that said I'd fabricated the entire case, that Erin never wanted me in the house, and that I was using elder abuse tactics to take everything from her. And what she didn't know was that Kyle had already spoken to me, already seen the court papers and the letter Erin wrote, and he texted me the message right after he received it with just one line. "She's desperate." And I didn't respond, because there was nothing else to say. And by Thursday, her car was loaded with the last of her things, her face pale, makeup streaked under her eyes like she'd finally allowed herself to realize this wasn't just a legal loss. It was personal, it was public, and it was permanent. And she came to the door that morning holding her last bag and said, "You don't have to do this." And I said, "Neither did you." And she stepped back like she wasn't expecting that answer, like she wanted me to be dramatic, maybe scream or cry or give her one more reason to tell the world I was the villain. But I just stood there calm and still, watching her process the truth in real time, that she'd played every card, burned every lie, and ended up exactly where she started, standing on a porch she never owned with a future she couldn't sell. And I opened the door and said, "You have until midnight." And she said, "Where am I supposed to go?" And I looked her in the eye and said, "Anywhere that isn't here." And then I closed the door, not to be cruel, but to be finished. And I watched from the window as she stood on the porch for a full minute, just frozen, before finally walking to her car, slamming the trunk and driving off without looking back. And I didn't cry, I didn't cheer, I didn't feel triumphant, I just felt done. And when the sun went down, I turned off the porch light, locked the door, and for the first time in months, let myself sit in the quiet without listening for her footsteps or watching my back, because she was finally gone, and the house was mine again, clean and unclaimed, and I thought that was the end of it, until I walked into the living room and saw the small flash drive she'd left behind on the coffee table, unlabeled, silver, just sitting there like bait. And my stomach turned because Madison never left anything behind unless she wanted it found. I stared at the flash drive on the coffee table for a long time, not touching it, not moving, because I knew Madison didn't leave it by accident, not after everything she'd done, not when every move she made was calculated and dressed in fake sincerity, and I thought about leaving it alone, throwing it out, pretending it didn't exist. But after everything I'd survived, I wasn't going to end this story with a loose thread. So I plugged it into Erin's old laptop, the one she never touched because she said it smelled like dust and grief, and waited as the screen lit up. One folder, no password, just a single file labeled Open Me, and inside it was a video, grainy at first, then clearer as the camera steadied, showing Madison sitting in Erin's home office, the same chair I just used to check my email that morning. And she looked straight into the webcam and said, "If you're watching this, then I'm either gone or you think you've won." And her tone was calm but smug, like she was still playing chess in her head. And she went on, "I did what I had to do, and maybe I crossed a line, but you were never supposed to stay here forever, Ellen. You were a placeholder, a guest who overstayed her welcome." And then she leaned forward, eyes hard, voice lowering. "Erin wanted to ask you to leave before he died. He just didn't have the guts to say it." And I paused the video, my jaw tight, heart racing, because even now she was trying to plant seeds of doubt, trying to dig at the one thing she could never take, my bond with my son. But I hit play again and watched as she said, "I told him we could build something if we had space, if he could finally let go of the past. But he was weak, he couldn't cut the cord, so I had to do it for him." And then she smiled, like that was some kind of victory, like isolating him from me was an act of love instead of control. And she ended the video with, "You can keep the house, Ellen, but you'll never forget this." And the screen went black. And I sat there for a moment in the silence that followed, not angry, not even surprised, because that had always been her, controlled, cruel, always needing the last word. But what she didn't know was that I already had the only thing that mattered. Erin's handwritten letter, the one she could never fake or overwrite, the one where he said, "I'm sorry," and told me the truth she'd spent months trying to bury. And I pulled that letter out of my drawer, held it beside the still frame of her face on the laptop, and felt nothing but peace because in the end, it wasn't about proving who was right. It was about surviving long enough to see her lose control, and I ejected the flash drive, tossed it into the trash, and deleted the file from the laptop, not because I was afraid of her lies, but because I didn't need reminders anymore. The war was over, the house was quiet, and every room was finally mine again. And that evening, I unpacked the last of my things from the boxes she had once labeled for removal, put Erin's photo back on the entryway shelf, lit a candle in the kitchen, and sat at the table alone, not lonely, just still, just present, just free. And as I sipped my tea and listened to the silence that no longer carried tension or fear, I looked out the window at the porch she'd once tried to claim and whispered, "My house, my rules," and smiled because for the first time since the funeral, I could breathe in a space that belonged entirely to me, not because I fought for it, but because I never let her take it.